Right. Okay, so on my screens. Okay, so welcome everybody. This is the first Tile Network meeting and seminar in this academic year. So here in Scotland at the University of Glasgow, the academic year has just kicked off last week. So we are all still trying to find our way through campus. But today we are going to talk about access is not inclusion with Dr. Gail Crimmins. Dr. Gail Crimmins is deputy head in learning and teaching in the School of Business and Creative Industries at the University of Sunshine Coast in Australia. She's a feminist academic who employs arts-informed and narrative methodologies to uncover and represent the voices and experience of often yet not be voiced women. Gail's research involves gender, inclusion, and diversity in higher education and working with women in rural, regional, and remote locations in Australia to support and understand women's leadership in these communities. She has published widely, including 3 books and over 30 academic papers. So a warm welcome to you, Gail. It's absolutely exciting to have you here today. And I'm going to hand over to you. I'm going to stop sharing here on my side.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. It's so amazing to see so many of you here today. Look, I'm just going to start with a few disclaimers. I start this with all of my kind of teaching interactions in a way to kind of just let people know that I'm very human and that this is a human interaction. I'm actually staying, although I'm living in the Sunshine Coast, I've been there for 17 years, I'm actually staying in Cardiff at my mum's place. So I've been staying here for just under a week now. My sister's very, very poorly. So I've been here visiting her. And so where I had set myself up to Zoom downstairs in the dining room, there are people here now. So I'm in the bedroom. So I've been trying to arrange a pillow behind my back and the duvet down so that you can't see it, but you may see glimpses of bedroom. And I start with that, not just to kind of, I suppose, reinforce the fact that this is a human interaction, but also to potentially or provisionally kind of introduce myself in that I came from a very working class background. So I've got a keen interest in, or had a keen interest in widening access when I first started my academic journey, if you like, and that's progressed and expanded because, as the title suggests, I understand now that widening access is not full inclusion, and so really that's going to be the main focus of today's session. Please feel free to ask questions. I know that there are regulated ways in which to do this through the chat, etc., but I'm not overly fussy or formal in my presentation. So if there's a burning question or comment, extension to something that I've said that you'd like to contribute, please feel free to contribute in real time. You don't necessarily need to wait until the end of the session. Before I start, does anybody have any particular likes, dislikes, anything that might help me make you feel as supported or as welcome as possible? Feel free to let me know if there's anything that you particularly want or don't want in the session, and I'll do my best to make sure that I kind of accommodate your needs. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm a little bit slow with some of these processes, so bear with me. From beginning, you should be able to see that slide now. Can you see that, everybody? All good?
Yes, all good.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. And now I just need to move this whole box, otherwise I won't be able to actually read my slides. So welcome again, more formally. My name is Dr. Gail Crimmins, and I'm a senior lecturer in communication at the University of the Sunshine Coast. And today's talk is really going to be not necessarily my own insights, but it's going to be based on the insights of some amazing scholars that I've had the privilege of working with, and I'll be sharing, contextualizing some of their insights around how we might make our learning and teaching environments, our universities more generally, truly inclusive. And again, this is going to be a snapshot of the insights that I've come across and that I've been working with, but I'd be really interested in hearing your insights as well. I know that we've got a lot of people here with vast amount of experience in this space. So really, your insights and your knowledge, your understanding, your perspectives are also really valued. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which I presented, or I developed this presentation. So I live in a place just north of Brisbane called the Sunshine Coast, and that's Kabi Kabi or Gubbi Gubbi land. And I'd like to specifically pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging within the lands of the Gubbi Gubbi and Kabi Kabi country, but also extend my acknowledgement to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and all Indigenous peoples on the lands on which you might be meeting today. I'd also like to acknowledge that the particular lands on which the presentations slides were developed are Aboriginal lands, and these lands were never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So this is just a really brief kind of context, and this is a snapshot of some of the things that we've all been grappling with and that our students and our colleagues have been grappling with as well over the last couple of years. The most significant phenomenon of the last few years have really illuminated how inequalities or inequities based along the lines of socioeconomic status, that's a term that we use predominantly in the UK, in Australia. I know in the UK you might talk about social class. So those, we're talking about socioeconomic status, but obviously with that, it's not just economic status. It's actually some of those subcultures that sit within some of those non-middle class kind of working class kind of contexts, etc. So based along lines of socioeconomic status, gender, race, and disability, and how these are both reflected both in the kind of main living contexts in which we engage, but also how these have impacted higher education, and also most importantly how I believe that they can be addressed by higher education. So really this is very much a practical discussion today, where although we understand the contexts are really complicated and messy and difficult to address, I will be presented some specific strategies that have been tried and tested in various locations internationally that have been supportive of addressing inequities within higher education. Now, when Carolina very kindly introduced me, she was talking about my methodologies and the ways in which I tend to work. So I'm a qualitative researcher, and I prefer context and qualitative kind of data in many ways. However, I do think that sometimes it's useful to start presentations or to start looking at the context in which we work around statistics. And there are a couple of reasons for that, but I think one of them is that we actually do live in an age of numeric nihilism, where there's great deal of skepticism around academics, around academic knowledge, and one would argue certainly with some heads of state, etc., or parliaments, governments, that there has been an attack on academia, and we can understand that perhaps some people in positions of power don't necessarily want everybody to have access to education, because once you are committed, once you've got knowledge and access to different ways of thinking, you can challenge existing hegemonic structures and knowledge bases. So this attack is also made manifest in an antagonism towards academic research in many ways. And with that, alongside it, enmeshed within that, is this numeric nihilism, which makes people suspicious about statistics and about research, etc. So I am going to start with some statistics, brief statistics, but statistics which really, for me, I think reflect widespread longitudinal inequity. And I think the reason I want to start with those, and the reason that we should still continue to research this space, both quantitatively and qualitatively, is because I think statistics can really provide an impetus to explore strategies to address some of these inequities, etc. Without some of these statistics, and I know there are complexities around naming equity groups, and therefore potentially simplifying the complexities of our lived existence and our students' lived existence, because as soon as you start categorizing, there are people that fall outside of, or those categories, if you look at it from an intersectional lens, some of those categories are not actually clearly kind of illuminating somebody's lived experience, because there are far more kind of intersections and complexities and compounded inequalities there. But still, I regardless of all of that, that's my disclaimer, I guess, is that I think that I think statistics can really help us, and they help those senior executives often making decisions about what happens in universities. They help them, I think, provide an understanding of why we need to address this. And obviously with that comes cost implications, etc. So I'm going to start with some of these statistics, if I may. So this is just a brief head count of all students at the University of Glasgow. Now, I've used the University of Glasgow because I was under the slight misinterpretation. I'm so sorry that many of the academics or many of the professional staff that I'll be working with today would be at the University of Glasgow, but I can see that you're from different universities. So this is just a snapshot of one university in one location. And it's really just kind of showing, if you like, the gender kind of breakdown based on, I hasten to add, the male-female dichotomy. Now, we do know that there are lots and lots of students that don't identify as either of those. We're starting to collect data on those other students, but at the moment, this is the main source of data that we have. And again, it just shows that we have yet a lot of work to do in terms of the way that we build up our knowledge. And again, if you just have a quick look at that table, that graph, sorry, you'll see that as across all national kind of contexts, there's been a significant rise, especially in relation to of increased populations in the university, and that there are far more women, people who identify as women, in the university sector as students than there have ever been. Yet, if we have a look at the breakdown of the different disciplines that those students are enrolled in, you'll actually see that there are very gendered stratifications within the disciplines that we have here. So, for example, subjects allied to medicine, but not medicine itself, highly populated with, and these are not my terms, these are statistics that I found, but with female students. And then again, if you have a look further down, that you'll see that engineering and technology, for example, is predominantly populated with male students, as is computing, etc. So we've still got these highly gendered disciplinary kind of stratification. And again, this is used often, this stratification is used often to suggest why there is that pay gap, gender pay gap, although we know that that's a much more complex situation as well. And I'm very happy to talk about that towards the end of the session if we have time for questions around that. But this is just a really brief snapshot of who our students are and then the sort of disciplines that they're enrolled into. In 2022, just going to get rid of this little black bar, there were 4.8 million disabled people in employment in the UK in 2022. But in terms of student population here, we've got in 2021 or 2020 to 2021, the proportion of disabled home students, so students who are considered domestic students across the UK, was 16%. So we've got a large percentage of our students who identify with disability. Each year, around 10% of all Glasgow University students disclose a disability. Now, we do know again that they're flawed statistics, because anybody that's done any research in this space understands that not every student with disability will actually disclose their disability. And there's a lot of discussion around how we can support those students who don't necessarily disclose. Apologies, I tried to change my slide then and it didn't work, so I'll try again. In 2018, the University of Glasgow launched a historical report on the organisation, and I got some words mixed up there, around the transatlantic slave trade, entitled Slavery Abolition in the University of Glamorgan. And the survey of Glasgow, and the survey of 500 students found that 1 in 2 ethnic minority students had been racially harassed. Half of all ethnic minority students reported being harassed between 2 and 5 times since beginning at the university. A reluctance to report such harassment exists because of a lack of confidence in how those incidents might be treated, etc., and fear of reprisals. And more than a quarter of ethnic minority students say there is a serious problem with racism. And apologies again, focusing simply on the University of Glasgow, because I think we'll probably find that most of our institutions would probably echo many of those findings. In terms of social class, again, I used the word socioeconomic status a bit earlier. It's often used interchangeably in the literature across Australia and the UK and other parts of the world. But again, this table or this graph here shows very, very clearly that there is still a glut of, or a predominance of, students enrolled in university from families with higher managerial and professional occupations as parents. So we're still not extending our access to students in the same way, by the same proportion, to students from other classes, other socioeconomic status, family backgrounds. So that's certainly an area that we need to consider as well. But today, I mentioned this earlier, we're not really looking at widening access. Today, I'm really focusing on the strategies for inclusion and diversity that we can engage in when we actually get students through the door. So it's the things that we can do within the actual learning and teaching and the research and the university culture space. Once students have enrolled, there is a whole other body of work available around how we might attract and engage equity groups or students from equity groups, but that's not going to be the focus today. However, I would like to think that a byproduct of creating a truly inclusive environment for students and staff would actually create, through word of mouth and through other mechanisms, perception of an inclusive environment. So we may again attract a diversity of students through that process as well, of actually making sure that it's a really, really inclusive space, so that other people don't necessarily feel on the outside that it's somewhere that they could enter into. So I'm just going to contextualize where the findings or the strategies for today's presentation came from, cognizant of the kind of many multiple and compounding structural barriers of participation or to participation in higher education. I created a volume of essays or chapters to illuminate what have been identified as tried and tested strategies to support inclusion and diversity in the academy. And then through, I was able to collate or curate 16 amazing chapters from people across many, many nations. And from that, I undertook a grounded analysis or grounded theory approach to kind of identify what are the commonalities, what are the common themes across these different strategies, whether that's a strategy to supporting somebody with disability or a strategy to supporting students from different racial backgrounds. So, you know, and all people in between, obviously. So really what I'm going to share with you today is what the grounded theory approach identified as those 4 key preoccupations, themes, frameworks, I guess, that were overriding across all of these chapters. So the 4 principles on which I identified these strategies were based were learner-centredness. And I'm sure many of you have been, very familiar with the idea of learning-centred learning and teaching. So learner-centredness more generally, though, across the university. A cohesive commitment to inclusivity, epistemological equity, and adopting a radical approach to inclusivity. And I'll explain and illustrate strategies based on these 4 principles through the rest of the presentation. But before I do so, it's just going to have a quick check-in. Does anybody have any questions or comments so far?
So we don't have any questions at the moment in the chat, but if anyone wants to, anybody
want to chat? No?
No, I think you can continue, and I will just keep an eye on the chat.
Thank you. Okay. So learner-centredness, and again, it means slightly different things to different people depending on context, but basically through the analysis that I undertook, my understanding or definition of it is focusing on students' existing situations, where they are now. I'm a firm believer in the notion that you have to meet students where they are, wherever they are, in order to bring them or take them on a journey. So it's really focusing on students' existing situations, capabilities, and aims from the outset, which really eradicates the requirement to create personal learning experiences, personal learning plans for particular students, because often that is based on a deficit model. So it's really ensuring that crafting or curating the learning and teaching material from the start, or the curriculum from the start, based on students' existing situations and capabilities is what's required. Learner-centredness works on the promise that non-traditional learners, and that's the diversity of students, as you understand, do not possess a deficit identity or situation, or a lesser set of skills, knowledges, social or cultural capital. They simply possess a different situation, a different set of capabilities from most traditional learners. So as soon as you start getting rid of this hierarchy of what learning or what knowledge is, it allows us to actually expand the notion of what is knowledge and what is a knower and who is a knower within higher education. So these are just some ideas of the strategies that people have used based on this concept of learner-centeredness. Gagai and McCallum co-develop. I know that there's been a lot of literature on this, so there's a really good practical example of that in the text. Co-developed curriculum based on outreach programs with universities, school and industry professionals. So rather than going, okay, so this is us as an academic institution, this is what we think the students need to know and be able to do, and we will construct our curriculum based on that. They've actually worked with university professionals, curriculum designers, discipline-specific knowledge makers, worked with schools, so that's secondary education and further higher education institutions, and industry professionals to say, okay, so what are some of the knowledges and skills we want our students to be able to have and be able to do, to not just function, and this is where I sometimes get a little bit upset, not just function in the workplace, we're not just creating workers for the economy, but also within communities. So a really expanded notion of what a graduate might be able to contribute. So they're often kind of citizenship elements to some of that as well. And that's a really interesting process of working with schools, with industry and with universities, so that again expands this notion of what the learner can engage in and what they can contribute to that learning environment as well. Now, Tazewell, and you will, well, some of you may have come across this notion of funds of knowledge already. So it's a pre-existing concept. It's a really interesting concept if you're working in certainly around basing your or developing first year curricula, for example. Tazewell in 2020 creates an inclusive environment through employing a funds of knowledge approach to curriculum design and pedagogy. So very briefly, funds of knowledge is based on the idea that every student comes into university with a fund of knowledge. And those funds of knowledge are as varied and as rich and as diverse as the student population. And like I mentioned earlier, none is lesser and none is greater. So rather than thinking, okay, well, this is the traditional body of knowledge that the student needs to be given, and assuming this kind of transmission model of the student is an empty vessel and we will pour this knowledge and we will pour these kind of capabilities in somehow into the student, it's actually not in the same way that Guy McCallum did, but it's a negotiated curriculum where the practitioner asks the students, what's your knowledge and lived experience of, I don't know, if they're teaching something around social work, of this particular scenario, how might you address this? What, in your lived experience, what professionals have you encountered, and what knowledge do you think they've had, what's your knowledge about that, etc. So it's actually drawing the students' funds of knowledge into the curriculum so that there is a relationship can be formed between their funds of knowledge, what they already know, what they can already do, with and through their own vernacular, with the more formal kind of terms, concepts, disciplinary terms, etc. So it's meeting the students where they are by inviting them to use their cases as case studies, their particular contexts as contexts for learning and building knowledge from their level of understanding as well. For Grimes, this is quite a different set of students that you might be considering now. For Grimes, learner-centredness might involve creating opportunities for students to take an enrolment break. So Grimes particularly works with students with disability, variety of diversity of disability, but she really understands that sometimes students can't all enroll for a 3-year full-time program or course, whatever you call it in your institutions, that they might need to have flexibility in terms of when and how courses or programs or units are delivered, including some of these specific elements of, so for example, taking an enrolment break. So really building the curriculum so you're not changing it every 2-3 years, so that you don't make curriculum changes that require a student to start on a certain date and finish within 3 years. So that, they've actually got 6 years or 8 years to be able to complete their program. But also understanding that some students really have a lot of capacity to work for short, intensive bursts of activity, and then we'll need perhaps a break. So actually compressed and intensive courses or units really work for some of our students as well. So the more we can modularize and create flexibility around the type of delivery that we offer is really going to be supportive of the diversity of students with their learning needs. So it's that flexible approach to study. She also identified the real need for many of our students to have access to quiet zones for study. So we know that a lot of our students might be very sensitive or highly sensitive to noise and other types of stimuli. So it's ensuring that there's a welcoming space that meets their learner needs on campus as well as off campus. So that quiet zone or that quiet working space, I don't know what happens in your particular countries, but for example, in Australia, we now have supermarkets that offer quiet hours where there is no music, where there are no tannoys used, etc. So it's a similar sort of notion that there should be learning spaces on campus that provide a welcoming, inclusive environment for our students. Also, that staggered kind of assessment needs to be developed, because we have got students that will need short breaks between weeks, or that will need compressed or intensive learning and teaching delivery. So again, if we can potentially not just stagger the learning and teaching delivery, but also the assessment dates, that is also going to be inclusive of our students that perhaps don't just follow a 12 or 13-week semester in the way that a traditional student might. And, we talk about this a lot, don't we? But actually, inclusive practice is inclusive practice. And these practices don't just suit people with disability. They actually suit a plethora of students with parenting responsibility or caring responsibilities. They often find that they have a lot of time available in certain weeks and no time available at other weeks. We have fly-in, fly-out workers, for example, in Australia. We often find that they work for they can work intensely for 3 weeks and then they'll be off for 3 weeks or whatever it is. So I don't want to think that these particular strategies are just for students with disability. Actually, inclusive is inclusive of everyone. So through offering formal and informal learning environments with flexible study options and flexible assessment timetables, etc., we're really expanding what is available to more of our students. And I think it's not just the way in which the learning and teaching is constructed and bottled, if you like. We also have to think about the content. What is it that we're engaging in? And if you think about it, a lot of the research, certainly through the chapters that I curated, identified that the kind of westernized curriculum design requires students to work often as individuals, individual assessment items, individual coursework processes, etc. And that can lead to a great deal of disconnect for our students who come from and prefer to engage in collectivist cultures. So a learner-centred approach might also be operationalised through the development of group work learning process, which doesn't necessarily have to be a group work assessment task, but may be an assessment task. But certainly the group work process really helps those students from those collectivist cultures. We also know that group work generates a great deal of diversity of approaches as well, so that we know that there are pedagogical reasons for including more group work process into our curriculum and pedagogy design. But certainly group assessment as well, really provides students with choice. So I think the point is here, a lot of this is around flexibility. We can offer, it's not too hard to be able to offer a student a choice of, you can work individually on this task, the same criteria, the same process, or you can work as a group. This is the process and this is the criteria for the group, and really offering that choice to students. So I think the key to learner-centeredness, I suppose there are two. One is meeting students where they are. The second is providing flexibility of assessment type or process, whether it's individual type, but also flexibility in terms of the way and how students can engage in their learning. Yes, we might need to get rid of some of our formal structures around how we teach, but certainly it would go a great deal towards becoming much more inclusive for a diversity of our students. Learner-centeredness requires developing learning processes and assessment practice that suit the preferred learning styles of our students. So I've just mentioned that about westernized approaches, which tend to be kind of individualist, but also involving and providing opportunities for collaboration, for discussion, for peer-based problem solving, both inside and outside of formal learning processes, really do help a lot of our students feel more included. The second key principle, before I move on to the second, does anybody have any comments or questions about learner-centeredness?
I think no, so far everyone is just acknowledging and very happy with how you acknowledge the different diversity, inclusion, and so on. So far, no questions.
Okay, thanks, Carolina. So what do I mean by a cohesive commitment? One of the things that struck me, and I've been in academia now for many, many years, so I don't just look this good because I had a really late night watching a soccer game because my son's mad keen on soccer, and I'm jet lagged. But I've actually, I've been in academia for a long time, and that makes you tired. And I haven't got any makeup on, so apologies for that as well. But the one thing I've noticed is that we can create, and many of my colleagues, some of my amazing colleagues, create really inclusive learning and teaching environments within their classes. But the institution more broadly is not as inclusive. Or they go on work experience. We call it work integrated learning in Australia, work experience in other places. You may have other terms as well. And they might go to an environment which is really not inclusive at all. So unless we make all of our processes, both within our classrooms, but also within the enrolment process, study skills process, the library, IT support, work integrated learning, unless we're really cohesive in our commitment to inclusivity and diversity and equity, obviously, then we're actually not going to provide that space that feels comfortable and inclusive to the diversity of our learners. So that's what we mean by a cohesive approach. A cohesive commitment to inclusivity is only achieved when it is shared by everyone within the academic institution and their stakeholder organisations. And those stakeholder organisations, for example, are the workplaces or hosts that we might put them in for work experience. They might be other organisations that come in and present or develop or deliver things curriculum-wise in our and to our students. So, you know, it's everyone that we engage with, everyone that through the university that the student will engage with needs to be as committed and have as an understanding of what it means to operationalise that inclusivity as well. So it's no good just asking somebody to do a 1 hour online inclusivity and diversity inclusion kind of short course. It's really making sure that that person is supported in embedding these principles of inclusivity in their action, in whatever they do, whether that's, like I mentioned, enrolment or study skills or whatever. So this can address, and this is something that I'm sure you're all familiar with because you are the people doing this work, which is why you're here today. There's a great deal of burden involved in doing equalities in AG. It falls on the same people. Often those people are themselves members of equity groups. So, for example, obviously I'm going to be referring to First Nations people here because I work on First Nations land. But these are predominantly adopted by people identifying as First Nations, for example, in Indigenous lands, but women, people from LGBTQI plus community, culturally and linguistically diverse people, and it's often exhausting and it can be isolating. You can feel like sometimes you're the only person doing this stuff. It's often not recognised in workloads. And we're often not resourced, in other words, being provided the professional development and the support that we might need to be able to flourish in our roles and for it to be recognised. So, many of us are trying to do this in addition to our real job, as if somehow this is secondary. So in addition, individuals who undertake these equalities work often lack, like I mentioned, the workload capacity and the intra and inter-institutional connections. So within the institution and outside of the institution to make those meaningful actions to tangibly advance equalities. It's vital, therefore, it'd be lovely if I've got some senior exec in the room today, that a whole of institution commitment is established by providing workload and training, professional development to support equity workers in their task, and engaging students and staff from across all areas of the institution. We can't have pockets of inclusion if we want to retain and allow to flourish students from those equity groups. Every experience should feel like an inclusive experience for them and for us as well. Additionally, it's important that all key stakeholders share the university's commitment to inclusion and diversity. Now, it's a long word and many of us are familiar with it, but I'll just sort of briefly and contextualize or provide what my understanding is of epistemological equity. So epistemology is a part of the kind of philosophical framework around what and how is valued as knowledge, how we value knowledge, who is valued as a knower. So epistemological equity is achieved when a diversity of knowledge, different types of knowledge, different types of ways of knowing, different types of knowers are included in all areas of the academy. So many of the contributing authors of this particular text that I'm referring to in this presentation identify that a narrow, masculinized, westernized, androcentric, very male-centered epistemological focus dominates the curricula and serves to maintain these deeply embedded inequities within the academy. And if our students need to see it to be it, I'll just go back and explain that term in a moment in a bit more detail. If they need to recognize themselves as valuable knowers and valuable knowledge, they have to be able to see people like them heralded as knowers, held up as guest lecturers, as academics, as people who are writing chapters or who are writing academic papers based on, within their discipline. So in order to really diversify, there's been a big movement, hasn't there, around decolonizing the curriculum. We actually need to expand. We need to understand what we mean by decolonize as well. We're not talking about perhaps just breaking down and expanding, the global south or literature and scholarship from the global south and the global north. We're actually expanding that whole thing. We need to see scholars from different equity groups. We need to see and hear and read and base our curricula on scholarship from a diversity of knowers in order to truly expand the epistemological range of ways of knowing, of valuing different ways of knowing within our curricula. So in order to be fully inclusive, these particular authors, they're cited on the slide here, they propose epistemological expansion, also known as epistemological equity. It's achieved when a diversity of knowledge, knowers or ways of knowing are included in the academy. These are some particular strategies. I'm really happy and would be happy to hear your strategies as well at the end. So life stories. Everybody has a unique, sophisticated, complex life story. And the way that you can build life story into your disciplines is that you actually ask students to write their life story, and then you link incidents, concepts, constructs from your discipline into that life story. So if the life story is one related to, a health incident, and you're teaching a health unit, then you're able to weave that discipline-specific knowledge, terminology, technical knowledge, etc., and mix that with that life story, or their understanding of that complexity or that particular theoretical or conceptual framework will be made clear through linking it with life story. Life stories can be used to provide an opportunity for students to relate their lived experience, and that validates their lived experience, that everybody has a valid lived experience, and understanding to conceptual or theoretical constructs. So obviously, as the academic, many of you will be academics, very, very familiar with these constructs that are discipline specific often, even though you might work interdisciplinary as well, and then linking that with their life story. The process encourages students to become authors and experts in their knowledge. So once they've told you and shared their life story, and you've linked some of those theoretical or conceptual concepts with it, then their assessments can be based on their life story and how they understand those concepts or constructs in relation to their life story. So they're able to demonstrate their understanding and their application of those constructs through narrative, etc., in different ways. Veg, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name. She's an amazing woman, by the way, if you look her up, advocates the use of gender-balanced reading lists to highlight women's philosophical, theoretical and innovative contributions to disciplines in syllabi. If people, I'll go back to this and probably will expand it now actually. You've probably come across the term, you can't be what you cannot see. Similarly, there is this notion that you have to see it to be it. And there's a lot of research in a lot of spaces, mainly in psychology, but in a lot of different disciplines as well, that identify that in order to be able to even aspire to take on a particular profession or role or being, you actually have to see people who look like you people who sound like you, with your accent, with your colour, with your disability, with your socioeconomic status, whatever that is. People need to see people like them, but not just one person. You can't just kind of present one person as the academic or as the author of something that you're referring to in your curriculum design, in your curriculum. You actually have to have multiple. So if you really want to create aspiration, and I know it's a contested term, and if there's time towards the end when we have a discussion, I'd like to expand this notion of why aspiration is contested. But if we do want a diversity of graduates in law, and I certainly want a diversity of graduates making laws and making policy, and I want us and them in education, and I want them and us in science, etc., because we know that they will inform the practice in those fields, and we need those fields to be as inclusive and expanded as possible. We actually need to show people like them as experts in those disciplinary fields. People like them, that look like them, that sound like them, that share the same heritage or whatever it is, so that they can actually conceptualize that it's possible, it's plausible for someone like them to be one of those professionals. So our syllabus, actually, I think we have a responsibility in our syllabus to make sure that we're actually really creating a diversity of knowledge and knowers by ensuring that our reading lists, the knowledge on which our students will practice and apply that knowledge, is diverse. So ensuring that students engage with a balance of experts, not just white males, is a gender mainstreaming strategy to contribute to epistemological equity. I argue that we can expand that, so it's not just looking at more women. We want people with different genders, we want people with different ethnicities, we want people with different disability, etc., etc., age, class, being presented as experts in each of those disciplines that the students will be enrolled into. So decolonizing the curriculum might be achieved by ensuring that white Western frameworks do not dominate, and I would argue they're kind of upper middle class as well, do not dominate, by embedding Indigenous, Torres Strait Islander perspectives, by embedding many diverse ways of knowing and thinking. So the final principle is adopting a radical approach to inclusivity. So a radical approach suggests that policymakers should be concerned with the outcome rather than the process. I'm imagining everybody here knows the difference between equality, or treating people equally, and embedding equity strategy. Sometimes we actually need to provide a different scaffold and support to some of our learners in order to bring them up to a level playing field. Treating both sets of students, I'm just trying to see if I'm in the screen here, exactly the same actually means that we maintain inequity. So really thinking about what is the outcome. If we want equitable outcomes, we actually need equity practices which privilege or which support certain equity groups in the process in order to bring an alignment, if you like, between different student groups. Higher education institutions will not create fully inclusive and diverse environments unless they're required to take a radical action with a focus on the equitable outcome and provide evidence of change. So we've got a whole series of different charters, different schemes, different programs aimed at, widening access, aimed at inclusion. But actually, if we're not measuring and being really hard, not being political with the way that we measure, not fudging it, but actually really measuring what our outcomes are in higher education, we will not create the change that we need, not just for students from equity groups, but for all of us, because we all know that we all benefit when all groups benefit. O'Sullivan advises that to enhance participation and be informed by insights, and this is one example of First Nations scholars, but those scholars need to come from a diversity of backgrounds. Obviously, we need a radically altered education system where Indigenous-led imperatives, and obviously in your different cultural contexts, that might mean different things, but where it is led by people who are currently underrepresented, not maybe one or two of them on a focus group or in a committee, but actually being led by people from different diversity and equity groups, informed by cultural connectedness and meaning for First Nations communities, will inform all academic practice. Now, that's going to require a lot of people to give up a lot of status. But the argument is we actually need to be led by the people with the lived experience of those marginalizations or those other status in order for them to be able to inform our practice. And I mean fully inform. I don't mean just, like I said, being an extra kind of person on a committee. And like I mentioned earlier, if this is equalities work or equity work, workload association and professional development needs to be provided as well. So my final point here is that sharing space, allowing people in without sharing power is just tokenism. So there is a difference between being present within a space and having the same rights to occupy the space. And if we're truly committed to allowing our students to lead us and to occupy space from which we can all learn, then we actually all have a great deal of listening to do and adapting to do also. So in other words, access is not inclusion, and we need to be much more committed to inclusion if we're going to create the environments that are going to be truly inclusive and in which all our students and all our colleagues can flourish. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we have quite a few comments in the chat. I think I have a couple of minutes for questions. There was one longer comment and a question actually in the chat by Toby. So I was wondering if, because I don't know, Toby, if you want to just ask your question, would that be something you wanted to do?
I don't know if my microphone works.
Yeah, no, it works.
Okay,
yes.
Perfect. Yeah, so thank you so much for this really, really meaningful and interesting talk. So one of the sort of thoughts or I guess even concerns I have is it's so challenging that I imagine that a student from a minority background only have to meet that their knowledge and their epistemology is not appreciated once before they would never want to do it again. Of course, that's an assumption, but how do we help people who are in that situation where they take that brave step and actually contribute with their real experience, and then they're not being caught in that, whether that be by course organizers or markers or peers?
Yeah, and that's that professional development that I was talking about, and it really does have to permeate every discipline and across every program and every course. We work, so one of the things that I did when I took on the role of deputy head of school for our school, we introduced inclusive curriculum principles for the whole school. Now we're only one school, we've got 2,000 students, but we're only one school. So that really helps when you can work with a whole school, because we know that no matter what course or whatever program the student is enrolled in, hopefully every single academic, including what we call sessional academics, but I think you might refer to them as casual academics, etc., in different institutions internationally, we also pay for their professional development. We make sure that they meet regularly, that we have school discussions based on this, examples of work, etc. So it works when there is that expectation across the whole school. It doesn't work, and that's that kind of radical approach, not radical approach, sorry, that kind of whole institution approach that's required. And that's why we really need senior exec to start, I don't like the word mandate really, but really start kind of ensuring that all of the schools work in the same way. It's hard. wish I had a magic wand, but I think you start in a program or a course and you try to expand that out.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry
we have
time.
We have a question by Elliot. So if you want to just come on and ask the question, Elliot.
Hey, so that was amazing. Thank you so much. If you were hypothetically, just to give an example, one of the people that is involved in those kind of interfaces with senior management, etc., do you have any particular advice for dealing with, again, hypothetical situations where people want to be inclusive, but they don't actually necessarily want to do any of the changes that would make things more inclusive? So it's like they would love to be inclusive as long as that doesn't involve having to change their worldview or see themselves or their current practices as not inclusive.
Yeah, look, I try to get, and this is really just my strategy, I try to get on as many committees as possible.
Yeah.
And then I ask really challenging questions.
Yeah, that's where I'm at. Yeah. Okay.
And I'm not popular.
Yeah.
And I even had the DVCA pull me in and ask me how far I wanted to go in my career.
Oh wow. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Good.
And I said, I'm very, very happy to be where I am, to be asking the questions I am. So I think it's really important. It's like I mentioned right at the beginning, you kind of try to meet people where they are.
Yeah.
So I try to understand what their imperatives are, what their KPIs are, what their needs are, and actually use a narrative or a discourse where the needs and the imperatives of equity and inclusion, for example, marry with their needs to expand the student population or increase a certain kind of, usually financial kind of measurement. So it's kind of, again, doing a lot of listening, asking them about where they are and what they need, and then making sure that they understand that actually being truly inclusive is going to help them reach and achieve their aims as well. You get a better audience, but you don't necessarily get as fast change as you would like. I think that's one of the things I should have premised this whole with, is that it takes a long time to create cultural change. I do a lot of listening, and I try to ask difficult questions, even if those are dismissed.
Thank you. That's really, really good.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Elliot. The next hand that was up was Helena.
Hi, Helena.
Hello. And again, thank you for the talk. That was really, really great. I think there's the question I have is more to do with those choices that you were talking about, because something that I've come a cropper of, or that I've had problems with in the past, has been offering choices to students and having choice in many ways they can see as being intimidating. Now, I think that comes from the perspective of, people come from their own learning culture to wherever it is. And maybe the majority of the students that I often have are people from a local culture who don't understand how these choices and things can work. Do you have any advice? And maybe this is a training thing. I don't know if it's a training for me or a training for students. I think I'm getting the balance more and more to be able to offer this choice to let minority voices speak a little bit more loudly in class, and I'm giving them those opportunities. But sometimes students have found it an intimidating experience when there is choice.
Yeah.
Because they would like me to tell them what it is that I want from them.
And they're so used to this hierarchical relationship, aren't they?
Yeah.
They
I think that's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the first thing is that I try to humanize my learning and teaching environments as much as possible, talk about the things that I don't know, talk about the things that I learned from them. I really try to make sure, as much as I can, that the students feel like they have a contribution, that I'm learning from them, and that the other students are really learning from them. Elliot mentioned there that they offer a kind of scaffolded choice, that you don't go straight in and go, right, you can do X, Y, or Z, off you go. So introducing what each of those things is. This is the way of working if you want to do it this way. This is, so making sure that the students know what that is, and not too much choice. So often it's yes, you can work as a group to do this, or you can work individually to do this. You can contribute through the discussion board, or you can contribute face-to-face in the learning environment. So I often don't give them a wide variety of choice, especially first years, because obviously they can spend forever not, trying to choose what kind of approach they want. So often it's minimal, and often it's staggered and incrementally built through the semester as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next question, Blue. Hello.
Yes, thank you. So I'm attending from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And one obstacle that I see happening in Canada quite a bit is our expert knowledge keepers. So our knowledge keepers, our elders, those that we bring in as guest speakers are still working with the gender binary because, they have themselves attended residential school. And so learning that gender binary and not being able to unpack that and only teaching from a focus of their traditional teachings that they learned from other people in spaces and places that were very gendered centered. And so, we're now making sure that we have direct communication with any presenter, any elder, any knowledge keeper, fire keepers, that they are gender inclusive, because with inclusivity, we can only teach to what we know. And if we have no knowledge of gender inclusivity, then that's what we receive. And we find that when that happens, then we also trigger our students again, who may be gender diverse, from the 2S LGBTQIA community, by exposing them to those that, they're not, we haven't really vetted them correctly. And so making sure that that vetting process is in place to make sure when it comes to inclusivity, someone may say they are, but do they actually involve us in all aspects of work or of ceremony or of holding space? So I'm just wondering, have you found that you've encompassed that as well with knowledge keepers and elders that are still teaching in a binary perspective?
Yeah, look, thank you. And I think you've given an amazing suggestion. You remember I talked about that kind of inclusive, the whole institution and all key stakeholders. That's a really good example of another suite of key stakeholders that we need to ensure are providing those kind of inclusive contexts and narratives for our students as well. Interestingly, and again, I'd be really interested to hear what the rest of us folks have to say on the Zoom call today. But interestingly, I actually find that engaging with, and this is just in my experience, some of the First Nations elders, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander elders with whom I work, I can have very, very open conversations around inclusivity, diversity, and extend their knowledge as well as mine through those conversations, so that they provide actually a really inclusive environment for our students. For me, it's often been my colleagues in other schools that I've had kind of a little bit more resistance from. So again, I've got one person who still writes about male brains and female brains and boys' brains and girls' brains and bringing up girls. He's an educationist and he's still publishing and still teaches those units. So actually, I think it's that professional development and that conversation that we need to have with our colleagues from other schools, from other departments, other areas of the university, as well as those key stakeholders. And it's interesting that you should say vetting. In many ways, I don't think we have capacity to be able to do that, but we certainly have capacity to provide the principles and some of the professional development and some of the conversations or story that we have with them, so that they have an understanding of how some of those languages and some of those examples or case studies or learnings might impact certain students. So that's the way that I work with it. But I'd be really happy to hear if some of you guys have other strategy as well, because it is a challenging process, I think, because for a lot of I don't want to kind of suggest this, but certainly for some of the more traditional educators, whether that's within the formal or less formal education space, I think gender identity is a challenging construct for them. And how do you engage with some of those stakeholders to ensure that their language, their examples, their narratives are supportive. Lou, how do you manage it?
For myself, I'm a Two-Spirit elder in Toronto, and I'm the only Two-Spirit elder in a population of 4.5 million in Toronto. And so it's with a lot of work, a lot of extra teaching, making sure that I attend and sit on many boards, as you said you do, to make sure that we are inclusive of all people, and to bring it back to our original teachings with solid, concrete examples of protocols that have been in place for years, but have now turned gendered. And so to unpack that gendering and make it all inclusive, such as our example of our medicine wheel or our sharing circles, which are open and inclusive to all people, regardless of where they're from, how they identify, what their understandings are, but to enter into a space with kindness, love, and compassion, and acceptance and respect for the diversities that exist, and creating that reciprocal relationship conversation and building those relationships on reciprocality, not just us teaching, but also them asking questions and letting us know where are they at in their journey, how are they applying techniques to make things truly inclusive and to make space for those that they may not know about, and to have those meaningful conversations so that, like for example, in the Cree language, a word is asked, Awina Kakina, who are you? And when we ask that question, at that point, our mouth should be closed and our ears should be open so that we hear whom identifies with how they want to identify and how we should address them and how we should include them. And so not us judging with our eyes or by our understandings of learned understandings, but to truly ask each individual, whom are you? Tell me about yourself so that I can address and respect you for who you are. That's the way I find that it works best.
Beautiful, thank you. And that focus on listening, I think I mentioned that a couple of times. I think we have to listen, don't we? Thank you. Yeah. Beautiful approach.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That was an amazing concluding remark for this talk. I'm going to upload a recording of this on our Tile Network website. I would like to again thank you, Gail, for this very inspiring and thought-provoking talk. Thank you so much. And I'm going to stop the recording now.